Ooh, a new Fnaf game came out. Let's check out what the reviews say. I bought this game for my friend, and he accused me of cyberbullying. This thing crashes an official ripoff game. Why? Fnaf World came out in 2016 to a mixed reception. There were a lot of people who tore down the game with critiques, some trying to be helpful, others not so much. So why are there still fans even to this day? What happened? And why did the developer Scott Cawthon even decide to make it? If you haven't played any of the other Five Nights at Freddy's games, you might be surprised to learn that Fnaf World is not like any of the other games. It's a real-time turn-based RPG, which plays almost like Pokemon, but with Five Nights at Freddy's characters. You can even add other characters to your party. So why all the controversy? Disliking games comes down to subjective playstyles. However, there are universal aspects that can impact everyone's ability to play the game. First of all, the pacing. Fnaf World's pacing is a tough love approach. You talk to Fredbear, he sees you on the flip side, you select your party, and are immediately just in the overworld hanging around. You walk around trying to figure out where Fredbear said he'd be, and BAM! An encounter with some enemies. You are thrown into a fight without really knowing what the tools are. Later you find out that you can hover over your moves to find out what they do, but because of the most glaring problem in Fnaf World, you probably didn't notice. The pacing is quick, and while you have some direction from Fredbear, at certain points you need to look up guides on how to progress past certain points of the map. Progressing each area of the map isn't impossible, but it requires a level of being detail orientated if this is your first time playing the game. But the need to be focused with this next aspect of Fnaf World can be quite challenging. Playing this game is overstimulating, especially for a first playthrough. In battles, there is so much happening at once that it is very easy to get overwhelmed, not in a difficulty level sense, but more visually. The lack of direction is not a great mixture with this, which can impact a new player's morale when playing through the game. The game can be visually inventive, and we'll cover that in a bit, but let's take a look at how leveling up is. Similarly, encounters get to the point of being more annoying than challenging. The amount of encounters can be a burden for players to go through, as it breaks any sense of flow going through the overworld. As for the quality of life, the loading screens for just opening and closing the menus are slow and infuriating. There is, without a doubt, a vast range of critiques for this game, some with merit, some without. In the case of new players, pacing along with visual elements can greatly impact the quality of life in a game. However, it is worth acknowledging that these critiques are for the game as it stands. The footage used in this video is the updated version. When the game first came out, it was in a rushed state with negative reviews pointing out bugs and broken features. But let's come back to that in a bit, because that needs to be explored a lot more in depth. So all this in mind, why do people like it so much then? It might be a lot more reasonable than you think. It's a fun game. Fnaf World is not the type of game that takes itself too seriously, and so it's not meant for the player to either. Yes, you can break down the game mechanics, but there is not only a much deeper story here of game development, but a lot of fun concepts that players might not regularly get to enjoy from a big franchise like Five Nights at Freddy's. The gameplay can be janky at times, but it blends in with the aesthetic that Fnaf World presents itself with. This is what a spin-off of Five Nights at Freddy's looks like, because it is one. After getting over the rough patch that is loading up the game and playing it for a few hours, Fnaf World has a lot of fun and interesting moments. For example, team building can be interesting. Fixed movesets provide a unique experience than that of playing games like Pokemon, because you aren't relying on optimizing stats, but instead different moves, which is a unique idea that is fun to play with. And for all the overstimulating graphic problems that this game has, its graphical issues fit well as a spin-off on the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. And with parts like going down the levels, it looks very visually interesting at times. Whether that justifies the experience for the player is subjective. Solving and getting past obstacles is rewarding as well. The euphoria and rush when finding out that the move Neon Wall blocks the alarm attack and finally beating the owl after fighting it 7 different times is also unmatched. However, the strongest point that makes this game enjoyable is the community aspect. Ultimately, this game is not intended for a solo play experience with no prior knowledge of Five Nights at Freddy's, and that is what discouraged a lot of players from continuing the game. Breaking down this game as a regular RPG, it is not a good game. It has terrible graphics, overstimulating designs, and near impossible puzzles that require guides to complete in a reasonably timely manner. But because it forces you to look up guides on how to progress, it brought players together and gave the Five Nights at Freddy's community a new interesting puzzle. Fnaf World is not a good game, but it can be a good experience, and that is why it garnered a cult-like following and why it has become some of people's favorite game, while at the same time being ranked the worst performing game in the Fnaf franchise. And that is not to discredit the creative ideas and inventive aspects of the game design either. It just means that the game's target demographic is not the casual player just looking for games to play. Some parts, like the Pinwheel Funhouse tent puzzle, ask too much from the player and would be impossible to solve without looking up a tutorial on YouTube or having a friend on a call guide you through it. It's a game not for a person to play, but a community, whether intentional or not. That is why it was received poorly, among with other game design flaws. How the developer Scott Cawthon reacted to the feedback was very telling too, and that part of the story is not as obvious, but his development of the game can serve as a lesson to not only game developers, but to creatives as a whole. Also, before moving on, the music is amazing. There definitely should have been audio settings to turn down the text or other sounds, but the music is very fun and adds so much life to the game. Shortly after receiving negative feedback from players on Steam, Scott Cawthon took down the game. It was initially in a rushed and unfinished state with game-breaking bugs, and the overall looking bland in a 2D environment that was difficult to navigate. A 2D world could have worked, and 2D pixel art can look amazing. In the last video about Stardew Valley, for example, you can see how well thought out pixel art can be. Not to say that that's what Fnaf World should have looked like, just that players were dissatisfied about the effort put into the game's design. Effort is noticeable in game design. Players, whether consciously or not, can recognize when passion goes into a project. But because of how rushed the game was, a lot of people felt disappointed. There were still positive reviews on Steam, even after the first release, but when reading through these, it becomes clear that they were already fans of the franchise, and it's easy to look past faults when you are a fan of a project. At the end of the day, a few flaws might not get in the way of enjoyment, and that is amazing. As we will cover later on, the real effort and passion poured into this game was in the details as opposed to the more obvious playthrough. But because Scott was excited to show off his game, the passion was missed by a lot of people because of the faults that stood in the way. So the game got taken down. But what happened after? Months go by, and Scott re-released the game with an update. Fnaf World now had a 3D overworld and a lot of bugs were fixed. Scott Cawthon apologized for the game's unfinished state and even offered refunds when he originally took down the game. But what now? Now to a lot of people, the game is playable, and on top of that, it is free, and due to that, it's worth checking out. As for his passion poured into the game, it's not apparent at first. See, this game was similar to the games he made before Five Freddy's. Fnaf World is a passion project, but not when it comes to your first playthrough. Typically, the player will follow the little instruction in the game and beat the security owl to get a weird ending. In the ending, it mocks the player for treating this like a regular game, by following the instructions and not exploring all the hidden secrets that the game may have offered. The player instead receives a cliche ending that knows it's a cliche, because that is not the way the game was intended to be played. Fnaf World has quite a few endings. The others are imaginative and can get creative. It's in these endings that the real magic can be appreciated. But most casual players will stop at this first ending. The game is a love letter to the Fnaf franchise and for real fans. It captured that passion that made them fans in the first place. People were wondering if Scott would finish updating the game. There are quite a few scenes where the game itself even tells you that the game is unfinished. However, he came out saying he wouldn't. He would move on and leave this as an unfinished project, saying, quote, "I know there may be a few people who will say that I should have kept working on it. The reality is that some of the mistakes made in development of this game were done very early. Fixing things would basically be remaking the game from scratch. At what point do you stop trying to fix a project that didn't go well and start working on something new? At some point, you have to walk away and stop trying to fix it." End quote. Scott Cawthon acknowledges that there were fundamental flaws that made up the game, and in deciding to move on, it's clear that he learned how to walk away when he needed to. This game has a passion trapped inside it, and instead of trying to pry it open, he can just make another game that can spread his love for game making. It's not giving up, it's getting back up again to move on. Creative people will make mistakes. That's the key to getting better. But trying to be perfect all the time and forcing that mistake to work just to please others will lead to dissatisfaction and frustration. Scott Cawthon, by making this game, became a better developer because he saw the errors that needed to be fixed, and that fixing them would take longer than just making a brand new game. On a greater scale, it would be worrying if he did not see the errors. To call this game a failure would be disingenuous. There are so many people who love this game and what it stands for, so to label the game as the worst game in the world is inaccurate. It has mistakes, sure, but for many it accomplished what it set out to do. People confuse moving on as giving up, when really by making mistakes there is a great insight on how to improve. Sort of like to figure out how to play Fnaf World, you just press random buttons and hope for the best. Thank you guys so much for watching. I noticed that we're really close to 450 subscribers, so I just really want to say thank you. The last video has gotten a lot of support, and I'm really grateful that you guys enjoyed it. Speaking of which, if you enjoyed this video, you probably will also enjoy that one. It's about Stardew Valley's game developer and how he spent like 12-hour days to make the game. And I think if you enjoyed this one, you'd probably enjoy that one. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and as always, I hope you're a bit less bored.